everyone hear me? Alito, Sahochapoya Ian Thompson, Choctaw Michinoholosia, Independence, Missouri, Amitulito, Kia Himano, Sadikchin, Eltitoklo Kakalanko, Oklahoma, Brinket Lashwan, Atko, Oklahoma Choctaw Oklahoma Historic Preservation Department, Noshkoboka Sia, Himano Choctaw Imalimpa, Hachimanolachi, Himanasi no Holo Imanoka, Noko Tosholachi. Hello everyone, I greet you in the Choctaw language. My name is Ian Thompson. I'm Choctaw and Euro-American. I'm from Independence, Missouri originally, but now I live with my wife Amy near Greenland, and I serve as the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Choctaw Nation. So for Choctaws, we're an indigenous people, and that makes us very special. Every person who's alive today has indigenous roots. They go back to some place on the landscape. Whether it's in Europe, Asia, South America, Australia, Africa, or North America, everybody has roots that go back. Well, for Choctaws, our roots go back to our homeland in what is now western Alabama and eastern Mississippi. And our oral stories place us back here about 14,000 years ago. This is a diverse area, and even though the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, we're a removed people, we no longer live in our homeland, we still have that connection that goes back. We can still see the homeland in our traditional culture and in our traditional food. Most of you have probably been to Mississippi. When our ancestors were living there, it was a different place than it is now. And that's because our ancestors very carefully managed the landscape in a sustainable way. If you go there today, you'll see thick forests that are overgrown with kudzu and poison ivy. It's not a very hospitable place. You probably wondered how our ancestors could live in that type of an environment. And really, they didn't. They lived in an environment like what you see up here. Right there where Choctaw villages were in the 1700s was a mix of pine and hardwood. You go a little bit farther south, you get into the longleaf pine forest. This was an open forest environment like what you see up there, and it supported a diversity of plant life and a lot of animals. Other areas, like what you see at the lower right-hand corner there, were in the prairie. There were prairies in the Choctaw homeland so vast that you couldn't see across them. You don't see that in Mississippi anymore today. Down in the lower areas, there were river king patches that stretched for 30 miles. That's what you see in the lower left there. So the environment was different. And like I say, it was carefully managed by our ancestors to support human life and to produce food. And they did this management by setting the woods on fire every few years. That opened it up, it made it diverse, and it supported a lot of different plant and animal species. 300 years ago, if you went to Choctaw country, you would see bison living there in Mississippi. You would see flocks of passenger pigeons that were so vast that they would block out the sun for 2 days as they were flying over. You would see Carolina parakeets that were green colored. You would, of course, see bears and alligators and some of the other amazing creatures that live there today. Choctaw culture, like anything that's alive, adapts and changes through time. It's just its very nature. It always has and it always will. The same thing is true for Choctaw foods. They've changed a great deal over our 14,000 years of history. What I'm going to talk to you about today, because we have limited time, types of food that our ancestors produced and ate 300 years ago. Our foods are very tied in with the landscape that our ancestors managed. And you can see this in the traditional Choctaw calendar. I've got a 12-month calendar here so that you can see how more or less the Choctaw months match up with the English months. But actually back then it was a 13-month calendar. It was based on the lunar cycle. You can see the Choctaw names for the months on the left-hand side. Of course, the English names in the middle column, and on the right, those are the translations for the Choctaw month names. And you can see how all of the months are either named after food or they're named after things that happen in the environment going on around Choctaw people. The Choctaw New Year began with the first new moon after the fall equinox. So this was late September, early October. And this incorporated, this month was the Little Hunger month, and the following month was Big Hunger, and then Big Hunger in the Choctaw calendar. This was a time right after the harvest. The crops were harvested just before the new year started. So the names of the months, Little Hunger and Big Hunger, are kind of counterintuitive. But the reason they're called that is the time when Choctaws started preparing to go out on the winter hunt. So the hunters would be fasting and preparing themselves spiritually. And then when they actually went out on the hunt, until the time when they killed an animal, they would fast too. So it was a hungry time for some of the men. Of course, the men would go out on the hunt. The ladies, some of them would stay back in the villages, and they would go out and gather hickory nuts, acorns, different types of seeds that came available at this time of year, and they would preserve the harvest for winter. One of the major social events during this time of year was the Feast of the Dead. Choctaws had that as a remembrance for members who gone on before them, and it was set up in a way that brought the community together. These are pictures of some of the foods that Choctaw ladies and some of the elder men would gather in the fall. The upper left-hand corner, those are hickory nuts. You know, there are accounts from 300 years ago that talk about native people going out, and in just a week's time they would gather enough hickory nuts to live for 3 years. Just like that. Of course, then they had to process them, preserve them. The upper right-hand corner there, those are lamb squirter seeds. Lamb squirter is a plant that comes up in your gardens. Most people think it's a weed. But the irony is there's more nutritious than anything in your garden. So Choctaws in the fall would go out and collect the seeds. The lower left there, that is a maypop. That's a native type of a pasture. That was the Choctaw traditional foods too. The hunt I talked about a little bit. The main animal that Choctaws hunted during this period was the white-tailed deer. The Choctaws did it through a stalking technique, which is what you see on the left-hand side there. Those hunters were concealing themselves under deer-hide decoys to pull a real deer and thinking that it's safe to let the hunter approach. Then, of course, the hunter shoots. The bow and arrow was the main weapon that was used in deer hunting 300 years ago. After the deer, the bear was the next most important food for Choctaws, followed by the turkey, followed by the buffalo. Foods were preserved through a variety of ways by our ancestors. A lot of the ways involved drying those foods out, sometimes exposing them to smoke. The creosote and tar in the smoke actually have preservative effects on what you expose it to. After the foods were dried and preserved, they would be stored in corn cribs. That's what you see in the middle picture there. Those were up off the ground, so it was harder for rodents to get to them. In Choctaw society, of course, we honor the rattlesnake. You can see the diamond patterns on the shirts that people are wearing. And the reason for that, one, is because the snake warns before it bites, unlike the cottonmouth. But two, those snakes would help kill the rodents and keep them from eating up the crops that have been stored over the winter. This is just one example of a food that Choctaws would have eaten in the fall. And as you can imagine from the month names, the Choctaw diet traditionally was a seasonal diet. It changed month by month. And recent studies have shown that that is what the human body is adapted to. That's the healthiest type of diet you can eat, one that changes with the natural seasons. These are other dishes that Choctaws ate at this time of year. You can see their Choctaw names followed by their English names. Most of these come from crops that would have been harvested in the early part of the fall. This brings us to winter, and it includes the Choctaw months, the names Wildcat, Crane, and Windy month. This is a time when some of the hunters came back into the villages to spend the coldest part of the winter. And from the villages, they would go out to nearby swamps, and they would hunt fur-bearing animals, things like bears, panthers, bobcats. There were also certain types of starchy roots that people would go out and dig to add to their diet during this time of year. So the winter hunt, as I've said, focused on the fur bears, bear, bobcat, and mountain lion. This is a Choctaw cooler made out of a mountain lion hide that you see up here. For hunting bears, Choctaws would go into swamp country, and you can hear a low rumble that it makes. You can hear that for a long distance. Choctaw hunters would go out in the woods and listen for that noise, and then find a hollow tree where that hibernating bear was slumbering. Then they would build a fire at the base of the tree. And those trees being rotten and hollow usually would make a lot of smoke when they burned. So that smoke would wake up the bear, and it would come out of the tree, and it would have no choice but to jump down. And when it did, the hunters would shoot it with arrows. It's kind of a dangerous way to hunt, but accounts from that period say the Choctaws were the most skilled out of any tribe to hunt a bear in that way. In the winter, plants store their nutrients in their roots in order to prepare for spring. And so this is the time when the roots are most nutritious. Choctaws ate different types of fruits. One of those was sawbriar. It's kind of a nasty plant, but if you dig down, it has these large roots. And you can process those, cook them up, and they taste like sweet potatoes. Choctaws also used arrowhead root, cattails, mud potato, black potato, a number of different roots. And this was the time of year when we would go out and eat them. During the winter, persimmons are the only type of fruit that's coming ripe. If you've ever bitten into a persimmon that's not ripe in the summertime, it's not a pleasant experience. They have a lot of tannic acid in them, and my grandpa used to like to say they'll turn your head inside out. That's kind of what it feels like. It can make you pucker so much. But by winter, they're nice and soft and sweet. They're a great source of vitamin C when it's scarce from other types of fruit. Choctaws would eat them fresh, or we would take them and make a pulp out of them, spread that pulp out, and make a fruit leather out of that. That's what you see at the right-hand corner. And then hunters would take that with them as they went into the field. It was a high-energy food. This is a recipe for a persimmon stew. It's pretty nutritious, but for a Western palate, it's kind of a different taste because it combines meat and the flavor of the persimmons. It's kind of an unusual flavor. You don't find that type of flavor in Western cooking. These are other winter dishes. They combine meat from the hunt with agricultural produce that's stored over from the fall with the root crops that Choctaws would go out and gather. The spring in the Choctaw Calendar includes Women's Month, Mulberry Month, and Blackberry Month. And this is a time when people went out and got ready to plant their agricultural fields. Before the agricultural fields came ripe, Choctaws would go out and gather a number of wild plants, wild springtime plants. In the pictures on the left-hand side, you see poke salad. The upper right, that's stinging nettle. The lower right, that's lamb. Talking about earlier. All of those plants, when they're fresh and small in the spring, can be picked and their leaves can be parboiled and they can use them as a spring tonic. They're really nutritious food. This is a recipe for poke salad. A lot of people still eat poke salad today. They usually put in a little bit of salt pork or some type of fatty meat for flavor. In the past, Choctaws would use bear meat or possum meat to flavor. Agriculture, 5,000 years, maybe 6,000 years, just to the north of the Choctaw homeland. This is one of only 10 areas on the whole planet where agriculture is known to have been developed independently. Choctaws didn't start doing agriculture until maybe 1,500 years ago. At that time, we were growing some of the plants that you see up here: sunflower, domesticated knotweed, marsh elder, domesticated lamb's quarter, and gourds. By 1700, Choctaws were focusing in on the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. And we had our own varieties of each. And today we're working to reclaim those varieties. There are just a few seeds left of some of our beans and some of our corn. And we're working to get those reestablished so that those don't die out. It's a really important part of our heritage. People would go out and plant the fields together. In the Choctaw village at this time, there were 3 different agricultural fields. One was a garden that was planted around people's houses. That was planted around March 1st, and people would plant an early ripening variety of corn there, along with beans, whatever their favorite vegetables were. Beginning around May 1st, Choctaws as a community would go out and plant a communal field down by a river, down by the town's water source. And everybody would work together, the men and the women and the village leaders. If you didn't work, you didn't get to eat. They would go out and plant the field with corn, and then a little bit later they would come back and plant beans around the corn, and then a little bit later they would plant squash in between the rows of corn and beans. As I said earlier, this is the 3 sisters. The corn grows up tall, and that stalk provides a place for the beans to climb. The beans are a nitrogen-fixing plant, so they make the soil more nutritious for the corn and they improve the soil. And then the squash and the pumpkins have broad leaves, and that shades the soil. It helps keep moisture in. It also helps prevent weeds from growing. So the 3 work together to help each other grow. And when you eat the 3 of them, they're a lot more nutritious than any one is by itself. They provide a complete protein. These are the dishes the Choctaws would have eaten during this time. The food selection is a little bit scarce because mostly it's coming from stored sources. There's not that much in the woods that you can eat this time, other than the greens that I just showed you. The Choctaw Calendar, summer months include sassafras month, peach month, Hickory month. And at this time of year, the woods are filled with edibles, so it was a good time to live. These are just a few of the edible fruits that grow in Choctaw country. The upper left-hand side is a sand palm. That's actually my favorite fruit. And George Washington and Thomas Jefferson agreed. They both planted that on their plantations. The middle top, that's a pawpaw. If you've never had one, it tastes like custard. It's about the sweetest thing you can ever eat. That's also the largest fruit that's native to North America. The upper right, those are muscadines. Most of you probably have experience with those. The lower right, those are blackberries. The center there, that's my wife, Amy. She's in the back here. They're in the green shirt. Say hi, Amy. And she is gathering sand plums. The lower left, those are possum grapes. And then this is just a small selection. There are many other fruits that were coming around at this time. All the agricultural crops were coming out. Boys and teenagers would go out and they would hunt the predators in the field. They'd hunt the rabbits, the squirrels, sometimes even the deer that were trying to eat the crops. For the small game, they would use blowguns, which is what you see pictured at the upper left. During the summer, the men and boys would also go out and fish. Sometimes the women participated also. There were many different techniques that were used. The simplest one is people would just go out with a big net and walk it down the stream valley, and then they would throw all the fish that they caught on the side of the bank. Sometimes people would dig pits next to a stream and wait for it to flood, and they'd pick up the fish out of those pits after the floods went down. Sometimes they would bow fish. That's what you see going on in the picture there. They'd use special arrows with barbed wooden points. That's what's pictured in the lower right there. Other times they'd use poison in the water to make the fish float up. There were all different techniques. The harvest was sort of staged. The small corn that I was telling you about would have come right about July or so. Some of these Choctaw flint corn and flour corn would have come right more in September to October. When that started to happen, when those flint and flour corn started to ripen, that was the high ceremonial time in Choctaw society. You know, that was like Christmases for a lot of people today. At that time, they would do the big corn ceremony. They would bring everybody together in the village. It was a time of renewal, a time of forgiveness. And then right after that, they would start to harvest and process and preserve the food for the next year. Just like in planting, everybody participated in the harvest, the men and the women. And then some of the food was put into a storehouse. You know, everybody contributed what they wanted to that storehouse money. But then community members could use that. If the house was burned down and they ran out of food, they could go to that storehouse and use that communal store to help them through the rest of the year. That was also used to provision war parties. It was also used if there were visitors to town. This is just one example of a dish that was eaten at this time of year. Walakshi's still a popular Choctaw dish today. Here's some other dishes that would have been eaten during this time. This was a time of feasting, but it wasn't so much because of the new crops coming in per se. It was because people were trying to get rid of the stored crops that had been left over from the previous year. That's actually why it's called cooking month, because they were trying to get rid of those surpluses and make room for the new crop. I'd like to share with you some of the contributions that Choctaw agriculturalists have made to the rest of humanity. We're not the only ones that grew corn, beans, and squash, but we were one of them, and we developed our own unique varieties of each one. And you can see up there the impact that those crops have the world over. Sunflowers are also important around the world. Some people, never think about it, but it seems kind of odd that Europe had enough people to exist there and also to colonize both North and South America. One of the reasons that happened is when Columbus came to the New World, he picked up all these different types of agricultural crops and he brought them back to Europe. They could be grown in a lot of areas where other European crops were less successful. So there was an abundance of food in Europe. This abundance of food led to a population explosion in the 15 and 16 and 1700s, which meant that people in Europe didn't have necessarily enough land to inherit from their parents. So they sought land elsewhere, and many of them came to the Americas. This population explosion also led to a lot of people living in the cities, which in turn helped to spark the Industrial Revolution. So in a way, Choctaws contributed to all of that, all of those world events. More specifically, Choctaw food has contributed to American cuisine in ways that people may not realize. If you've ever had Cajun cuisine, that's heavily inspired by Choctaw. Like filet gumbo, for example. The filet powder in gumbo is a Choctaw spice. It's a Choctaw stew thickener. The Choctaws would trade to Europeans at places like Mobile and New Orleans, and that got incorporated into the food, along with many other Choctaw dishes. Southern food in general is highly influenced by Choctaw agriculture and Choctaw chefs. Most of the ingredients in Southern food actually come from Choctaws and other native southeastern people. Even barbecue is influenced by Choctaw food. The word barbecue comes from the Spanish word barbacoa. That was the name for a type of cooking rack that was used by native people living in the Caribbean and also the southeastern United States, including Choctaws. So that cooking method was taken into European society, and then Europeans and African Americans developed some of the sauces, and then the social tradition came originally from native people, but then it was expounded upon by others who came to the New World, and eventually you have this multinational tradition that is barbecue. Of course, that's one of the hallmarks of American society today. So I realize I'm out of time, but does anyone have any questions? I'll answer them for you real quick. Right now, many of them exist only by a handful of seeds, literally. So we're working to grow those out to get more of them. Our office this year is offering seeds for the Choctaw squash and for the lamb's quarter. We sent those out to 50 Choctaw families this year, and if you're interested, just contact me. Send me an email and we'll send you some too. It's probably not too late to plant them. All right, I thank you all for your time. Enjoy your lunch.